What the antique dealers at Peterson's estate sales didn't know was that the tired-looking veteran they were dismissing over a worthless jewelry box was about to uncover documents that would make him $2.8 million richer. They were about to watch their biggest mistake unfold right in front of them. Marine Corps veteran David Rodriguez pulled his weathered Honda Civic into the crowded parking lot of Peterson's estate sales. At 29, David looked older than his years. 3 tours in Iraq had left their mark in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved his left shoulder, still stiff from shrapnel 2 years ago. He wasn't here by choice. His grandmother Elena had passed away 3 weeks ago, and the funeral expenses had drained what little savings he had. The small apartment in Riverside, California was filled with her belongings, and his landlord was already asking questions about next month's rent.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
David needed to sell something, anything, to keep his head above water. The estate sale was buzzing with activity. Well-dressed dealers with expensive jewelry and sharp suits moved through the crowd like sharks, snapping up valuable items with the confidence that came from years of experience and deep pockets. David felt out of place in his faded jeans and military-issued jacket, but he clutched the small wooden jewelry box his grandmother had specifically left to him in her will. "Take care of my little treasure box, Mijo," she had whispered to him during her final hospital visit. "It's more special than it looks." At the time, David had smiled and nodded, thinking she was just being sentimental about an old piece of furniture. The box was worn and scratched, its brass hinges tarnished with age. To most people, it looked like the kind of thing you'd find at a garage sale for $5. David stepped out of his car, the California sun warming his face as he surveyed the chaos of the estate sale. Cars with out-of-state license plates lined the street, professional buyers who traveled hundreds of miles for events like this. He recognized the type immediately, the same calculating look he'd seen in military contractors overseas, always hunting for the next profitable opportunity. His phone buzzed with another text from his landlord. "David, need to discuss rent situation. Call me." He silenced the phone and shoved it deep into his pocket. The disability checks from the VA barely covered his basic expenses, and his part-time job at the hardware store wasn't enough to bridge the gap. After 3 deployments and a Purple Heart, this wasn't exactly the homecoming he'd imagined. Walking toward the entrance, David passed clusters of antique dealers examining items with magnifying glasses and testing the weight of silver pieces. Their conversations were filled with insider knowledge about makers' marks, authenticity certificates, and market values. One woman in her 50s, wearing rings on every finger and carrying a leather-bound notebook, was already photographing items to research later. "Victorian era, definitely authentic," she was telling her companion while examining an ornate mirror. "The craftsmanship alone makes it worth at least $3,000. David tightened his grip on his grandmother's jewelry box. Elena Rodriguez had been a house cleaner for wealthy families in Beverly Hills for 40 years. She'd raised David alone. After his parents died in a car accident when he was 8, working double shifts to put food on the table and keep him in school. Her tiny apartment had been filled with small trinkets and keepsakes, but nothing that screamed valuable. The jewelry box had sat on her dresser for as long as David could remember. As a child, he'd watched her carefully select pieces from it. Each morning, usually just her simple gold wedding band and a small silver cross necklace. She'd never seemed to treasure it particularly, never mentioned it was anything special, but during her final weeks in the hospital, she'd grown increasingly insistent about the box. "Promise me you'll keep it safe," she'd said, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "There are things inside that matter more than you know." Her eyes had held an urgency that puzzled him then and haunted him now. David had spent the last 3 weeks going through her apartment, packing her belongings into boxes for donation. He'd found photo albums filled with pictures of her various employers' families, thank you cards from children she'd helped raise, and decades of carefully saved greeting cards. But nothing that explained her fixation on the jewelry box. The box itself contained exactly what he'd expected: costume jewelry, a few silver pieces that might be worth something at a pawn shop, and her wedding ring. He'd examined every piece, looking for hidden value, but found nothing extraordinary. The box had a small felt-lined compartment at the bottom, but it appeared empty except for some loose threads and what looked like old glue residue. Standing outside Peterson's estate sales, David felt the weight of desperate circumstances pressing down on him. The medical bills from his own treatment were still coming in, his car needed repairs he couldn't afford, and he was 3 weeks behind on rent. His grandmother had always been practical. She wouldn't have sent him on a wild goose chase if there wasn't something real to find. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a decorated Marine who'd survived IED explosions and firefights in Fallujah, brought low by the simple reality of civilian life. His fellow veterans talked about this all the time, how the skills that kept you alive in combat didn't necessarily translate to success in the job market. David took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance of the estate sale. The box under his arm felt heavier than it should, weighted with his grandmother's mysterious final words and his own desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd known something he didn't. Inside, he could see the antique dealers already circling their prey, their practiced eyes scanning for anything the untrained might overlook. What they didn't know was that the quiet veteran walking through their midst was carrying something that would change everything they thought they knew about. Hidden value. The stage was set for a discovery that would shock everyone in that room, including David himself. David pushed through the glass doors of Peterson's estate sales, the cool air conditioning hitting his face as he entered a world that felt completely foreign to him. The building had once been a furniture showroom, its high ceilings and polished concrete floors now hosting tables laden with someone else's lifetime of possessions. The contrast was jarring. While David struggled to scrape together rent money, the people around him casually discussed five-figure purchases like they were buying groceries. A man in an expensive suit was haggling over a Persian rug, claiming it was only worth $12,000 in its current condition. David's entire net worth wouldn't cover half that amount. His military training kicked in automatically as he surveyed the room. Exit points, crowd density, potential threats, old habits that had kept him alive in Mosul but felt absurd in a California estate sale. Still, he couldn't shake the hyper-awareness that had become second nature after watching too many friends come home in flag-draped coffins. David's grandmother Elena had always been his anchor. When he'd shipped out for his first deployment, she'd pressed a small St. Christopher medal into his palm. "Bring yourself home to me, Mijo," she'd whispered. He'd carried that medal through 3 tours, through firefights and IED explosions. Through the long months of recovery after the shrapnel tore through his shoulder, Elena had never asked him about the war. She seemed to understand that some things were too heavy to share over Sunday dinner. Instead, she'd filled their conversations with neighborhood gossip, updates on her employers' families, and gentle reminders to take his medications. She'd been his connection to normal life when everything else felt like chaos. The job market had been brutal for David after his discharge. Despite his Purple Heart and commendations, civilian employers seemed uncomfortable with his military background. They'd thank him for his service with empty smiles, then find reasons to hire someone else. The hardware store job was a blessing. The owner was a Vietnam veteran who understood that combat experience didn't make someone unemployable, but even with the job and his disability payments, David was barely treading water financially. The VA healthcare system was overwhelmed, meaning he often waited months for appointments while paying out of pocket for treatments his shoulder needed. His apartment was a studio in a rough part of Riverside, the kind of place where gunshots at night didn't warrant calling the police. David moved through the estate sale, watching the dealers work with practiced efficiency. They had systems, networks, connections he couldn't even imagine. A woman with perfectly styled gray hair was photographing everything with a professional camera, already planning her resale strategy. A younger man in designer jeans was making phone calls to clients, describing pieces he thought they'd want. "The Tiffany lamp is authentic, probably 1920s, he was saying into his Bluetooth headset. "I can get it for $8,000, flip it for $15 easy." David thought about his grandmother's evening routine. After her long days cleaning houses in Beverly Hills, she'd come home exhausted but always took time to carefully arrange her few pieces of jewelry back in the wooden box. She'd handle each piece with reverence, as if they held memories more valuable than their material worth. Elena had worked for the same 3 families for decades. The Ashfords, the Prestons, and the Weatherbys. Old money families with houses that could have fit David's entire apartment building in their foyers. She'd raised their children, organized their social events, and kept their secrets. They'd trusted her with keys to safes, access to private areas, knowledge of family dramas that never made it to the society pages. "Your grandmother was like family to us," Mrs. Ashford had said at the funeral, her genuine tears surprising David. "She knew things about our family that we'd forgotten ourselves. Always so discreet, so trustworthy." The comment had stuck with David. What kind of things? Elena had been intensely private about her work, bound by decades of loyalty to families who'd employed her. She'd mentioned the Weatherbys occasionally, how their daughter had struggled with addiction, how the family had quietly funded several charity organizations, how they'd helped other immigrants find work and housing. David fingered the jewelry box under his arm, remembering how Elena had grown agitated during her final hospital stay whenever he mentioned selling any of her belongings. She'd made him promise 3 times to keep the box safe, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "The families I worked for, they weren't just employers," she'd told him during one of their last conversations. "We took care of each other. There are things, connections that matter more than money, Mijo. But sometimes they become the same thing."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
At the time, David had attributed her cryptic words to the pain medications. Elena had always been straightforward, practical. She'd never spoken in riddles before. But as he stood surrounded by people who made fortunes from recognizing hidden value, her words felt more significant. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his buddy Marcus, another Iraq veteran who'd been following David's situation. "How's it going, man? Any luck with your grandma's stuff?" David stepped outside to take the call, leaving behind the air-conditioned comfort and marble floors for the parking lot's heat and asphalt reality. "Still looking," David replied, watching a dealer load a 19th-century armoire into a custom truck. Starting to think she was just being sentimental about some old jewelry. "Elena was sharp as a tack, brother," Marcus said. "Remember when she figured out your landlord was overcharging you before you even realized it? That woman didn't miss anything." As David ended the call and prepared to re-enter the estate sale, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His grandmother had spent 40 years in the homes of some of California's wealthiest families. She'd earned their trust, kept their secrets, and somehow accumulated something valuable enough to hide in a jewelry box. The question was, what had she found, and why had she trusted only him to discover it? David re-entered the estate sale with renewed determination, the jewelry box feeling lighter in his hands despite the weight of his expectations. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made even the most ordinary objects seem touched with possibility. He found a quiet corner near a display of vintage books and carefully opened his grandmother's jewelry box for what felt like the 100th time. The familiar scent of old wood and Elena's favorite lavender soap drifted up, bringing with it a flood of childhood memories. Sunday mornings when she'd let him help organize her jewelry while she told stories about the families she worked for. Always careful never to reveal anything too personal, the contents looked exactly as they had every other time he'd examined them: Elena's simple gold wedding band, a silver cross necklace, a few pairs of costume earrings, and a small brooch shaped like a butterfly that had belonged to her own mother. Nothing that screamed hidden value. Nothing that explained her final cryptic words. David lifted each piece carefully, feeling their weight, examining them for any detail he might have missed. The wedding band was thin and worn smooth from decades of wear. The cross was tarnished silver, probably worth $20 at most. The costume jewelry was exactly that, pretty but worthless pieces Elena had collected over the years, but as he held the butterfly brooch up to the light, David noticed something he'd overlooked before. One of the wings seemed slightly loose, as if it had been damaged and repaired. Elena had always been meticulous about maintaining her few precious possessions. It was unlike her to keep something in poor condition unless it held special meaning. Around him, the estate sale continued its predictable rhythm. An elderly woman was examining china patterns with a magnifying glass, muttering about chip damage and manufacturer marks. A young couple debated whether a mid-century modern chair was worth the asking price. These people knew what they were looking for, had spent years learning to spot value where others saw junk. David envied their confidence. Every conversation around him was peppered with terms he didn't understand: provenance, authentication, market trends. He felt like an outsider in a world where knowledge was power and ignorance was expensive. His phone rang, displaying his landlord's number. David let it go to voicemail, not ready to have that conversation yet. He needed more time, needed to figure out what Elena had been trying to tell him. She'd never been one for dramatic gestures or mysterious gifts. If she'd said the box was special, she'd meant it. David thought about the last time he'd visited Elena's apartment, 3 weeks after her funeral. Walking through those familiar rooms had been like stepping through a museum of his own childhood. The kitchen table where she'd helped him with homework. The living room where they'd watched old movies together. The bedroom where she'd kept her jewelry box on the dresser, next to a photograph of his grandfather and her prayer candles. He'd been systematic in his packing, dividing her belongings into categories: keep, donate, sell. Most of it went to charity. Clothes that smelled like her perfume, kitchen items she'd collected over decades, books in both English and Spanish that had taught her to read better so she could help David with his schoolwork, but certain things had been harder to categorize. The thank you notes from her employer's children, some now adults with children of their own. Holiday cards from families who'd clearly stayed in touch long after Elena had stopped working for them. A collection of photographs that told the story of her 40-year career in Beverly Hills mansions. One photo had particularly caught David's attention. It showed Elena at what appeared to be a formal family gathering, not as hired help, but seated at the table with the family like an honored guest. The inscription on the back read, "For Elena, with love and gratitude, the Weatherby family, Christmas 1987. The Weatherbys. Elena had mentioned them more than any other family, always with a mix of affection and something David couldn't quite identify. Respect, maybe, or gratitude. She'd worked for them for over 20 years, had been there when their children were born, when the family had faced various crises, when they'd celebrated major milestones. Mrs. Weatherby trusted me with everything, Elena had told him once. That family went through some hard times, but they always took care of the people who took care of them. David carefully examined the butterfly brooch again, this time noticing tiny engraving on the back that he'd missed before. The letters were so small they were barely visible, EW, Forever Grateful, MW. Elena's initials and someone with the initials MW, presumably a Weatherby family member. The discovery sent a small thrill through David's chest. This wasn't just costume jewelry, it was a gift, possibly from Mrs. Weatherby herself. But why would Elena have considered it so valuable? The piece itself couldn't be worth more than a few $100s, even if it was real gold. A shadow fell across his corner as someone approached. David looked up to see a woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed, examining the vintage books near where he sat. She had the same polished appearance as the other dealers, but something about her seemed different. More refined, less predatory. "That's a lovely piece," she said, nodding toward the brooch in David's hands. "May I ask where you acquired it?" David's military instincts kicked in, friendly approach, but gathering intelligence. He closed the jewelry box protectively. "It belonged to my grandmother." The woman smiled warmly. "I couldn't help but notice the craftsmanship. It looks like something from a very exclusive Beverly Hills jeweler. Probably custom made. Your grandmother had excellent taste." As the woman moved on to examine other items, David felt his heart rate quicken. Exclusive Beverly Hills jeweler. Custom made. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to shift into place, but he still couldn't see the complete picture. Whatever Elena had hidden in this box, whatever secret she'd tried to protect, David was finally beginning to understand that his grandmother's 40 years in Beverly Hills had given her access to something far more valuable than costume jewelry. The question now was whether he had the courage to discover what it was. David's hands moved over the jewelry box with the same methodical precision he'd once used to disarm improvised explosive devices in Fallujah. 3 tours had taught him that the difference between life and death often lay in the details others missed: the wire that seemed out of place, the disturbance in the dirt that didn't match the surrounding area, the weight distribution that felt wrong. And now, sitting in the corner of Peterson's estate sales, those same skills were telling him something was off about his grandmother's jewelry box. The proportions weren't quite right. The interior felt shallower than the exterior dimensions suggested. And that felt-lined bottom compartment that appeared empty. Why would a jewelry box have a compartment that served no purpose? David ran his fingers along the edges of the felt lining, feeling for inconsistencies. In Iraq, he'd learned to trust his sense of touch as much as his eyes. IED makers were crafty, but they couldn't disguise the subtle differences in texture, temperature, and density that betrayed hidden mechanisms. The felt was old and slightly loose in one corner, as if it had been removed and replaced multiple times over the years. David pressed gently along the edges, feeling for give or movement. There, in the back left corner, the felt shifted slightly under pressure, revealing what felt like a small gap beneath. His military training had taught him patience. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to people getting hurt. David glanced around the estate sale to make sure no one was watching him too closely. The dealers were absorbed in their own hunts, haggling over prices and examining authenticity marks with jeweler's loupes, using his thumbnail, a technique he'd learned for handling sensitive electronics in combat zones. David carefully worked at the corner of the felt lining. It came up easier than he'd expected, as if Elena had designed it to be discoverable by someone who knew to look for it. Beneath the felt was a thin wooden panel, barely 1/8 of an inch thick. David's pulse quickened. This wasn't original construction. Someone had modified this jewelry box to create a hidden compartment. The craftsmanship was amateur but effective, the kind of improvised solution Elena might have managed with basic tools and determination. The panel had a small notch cut into one edge, just large enough for a fingertip. David hooked his finger into the notch and lifted gently. The panel came up smoothly, revealing a space about 6 inches square and perhaps half an inch deep. Not large, but big enough to hide something flat and valuable. Inside was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties. Elena's distinctive handwriting was visible on the front. For David, the truth about the Weatherbys. David's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the envelope. Whatever was inside had been important enough for Elena to hide it for years, possibly decades. Important enough to modify furniture and keep secret from everyone, including her own grandson. The envelope felt substantial, not just a single document, but multiple papers. David could feel the outline of what might be photographs. and something that felt like thick cardstock or official documents. His demolition training had taught him to handle delicate materials with extreme care, and he applied that same caution now. Before opening the envelope, David surveyed his surroundings again. His military experience had made him acutely aware of operational security, who was watching, who might be listening, who could pose a threat to mission success. The estate sale provided perfect cover. Everyone was focused on their own treasure hunts, and the constant movement and conversation would mask any discoveries he made. A man in an expensive suit walked past, talking loudly into his phone about acquiring a complete set of Bavarian crystal for a client. A woman with perfectly manicured nails was photographing silverware with professional lighting equipment. These people dealt in objects with clear, established values. Whatever Elena had hidden was something else entirely. David's grandmother had been smart enough to work for Beverly Hills elite for 40 years without ever being accused of theft or indiscretion. She'd navigated complex family dynamics, kept sensitive secrets, and earned trust that extended far beyond her job description. If she'd hidden something, she'd had good reason. The weight of the envelope in his hands felt significant in a way that had nothing to do with its physical mass. David thought about Elena's final words, her insistence that he keep the jewelry box safe, her cryptic references to connections that matter more than money, and things that sometimes become the same thing. 3 tours in Iraq had taught David that intelligence was often more valuable than weapons. The right information at the right time could change everything, prevent ambushes, save lives, alter the course of entire operations. Elena had worked in houses where family secrets, business dealings, and personal relationships intersected. With serious money and power, what kind of information might a trusted housekeeper accumulate over 4 decades of service to wealthy families? What might she have seen, heard, or inadvertently discovered that would be valuable enough to hide in a secret compartment? David's combat experience had also taught him that some knowledge was dangerous. Information that seemed harmless could put targets on your back if it fell into the wrong hands. Elena's secrecy might not have been just about protecting valuable documents, it might have been about protecting her family. As David prepared to open the envelope, he felt the same mix of anticipation and caution he'd experienced before entering buildings that might contain enemy combatants. The unknown could be life-changing, but it could also be life-threatening. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the estate sale floor. Other buyers were starting to make their final purchases and head toward the checkout area. David realized he was running out of time to examine Elena's hidden treasure in relative privacy, whatever his grandmother had entrusted to him, whatever truth about the Weatherby family she deemed important enough to hide for years. David was about to discover it. His military training told him to proceed with caution, but his desperate financial situation demanded he move forward. The envelope felt warm in his hands, as if it contained Elena's final gift to the grandson she'd raised and loved. Whatever was inside would either solve his problems or create entirely new ones. There was only one way to find out which. David was about to break the seal on the envelope when the atmosphere in Peterson's estate sales suddenly shifted. The steady hum of conversation dropped to a whisper, and heads turned toward the entrance as 3 men in expensive suits walked through the door with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. These weren't typical estate sale browsers. The lead man was tall and silver-haired, probably in his 60s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than David's car. His companions flanked him like bodyguards, one younger, built like a former athlete, the other older with calculating eyes that swept the room with professional assessment. David's military instincts kicked into high alert. The way they moved, the way they positioned themselves, the subtle hand signals between them, these men had training. Not military, but something else. Corporate security, maybe, or private investigation. The kind of people who made problems disappear quietly and efficiently. "Excuse me," the silver-haired man said to the estate sale coordinator, his voice carrying easily across the now quiet showroom. "I'm Richard Blackstone from Blackstone and Associates. We're representing certain interested parties regarding items that may have belonged to Elena Rodriguez." David's blood went cold. They were here for his grandmother's belongings. But how did they even know about the estate sale? He'd barely decided to come here himself, and Elena's death hadn't been widely publicized. Someone had been watching, waiting, tracking Elena's possessions. The coordinator, a nervous woman in her 50s named Mrs. Chen, fumbled with her clipboard. I'm not sure what you mean. We don't have any items from an Elena Rodriguez. This is the Peterson estate sale." Blackstone smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps there's been some confusion. We have reliable information that certain items of significant value to our clients may have found their way here through indirect channels." David forced himself to remain perfectly still in his corner, the envelope hidden beneath the jewelry box. His explosive ordnance disposal training had taught him that sudden movements attracted attention, and right now he needed to be invisible. But every fiber of his being was screaming danger. The younger man with the athletic build was already moving through the crowd, his eyes scanning faces and examining people's belongings with practiced efficiency. He wasn't browsing, he was hunting. When his gaze swept past David's corner, it lingered for just a moment too long on the jewelry box. "Sir," Mrs. Chen was saying, her voice rising with anxiety, "I have all the documentation for every item in this sale. Everything here belonged to the Peterson family. I can show you the inventory sheets." "That won't be necessary," Blackstone replied smoothly. "We're particularly interested in any jewelry boxes, especially wooden ones that might appear unremarkable to the untrained eye." The words hit David like a physical blow. They weren't here by coincidence or fishing expedition, they knew exactly what they were looking for. Somehow, someone had connected Elena's death to the jewelry box and tracked it to this estate sale. But who? And why? David thought about Elena's final weeks in the hospital, how she'd grown increasingly paranoid about visitors, how she'd made him promise multiple times to keep the jewelry box safe. At the time, he'd attributed it to medication and illness. But now he realized Elena had been genuinely afraid of something. The older man with calculating eyes was now examining the crowd more systematically, studying faces and body language. David recognized the technique, threat assessment, looking for anyone who seemed nervous, out of place, or trying too hard to appear casual. David forced his breathing to remain steady and his posture relaxed, drawing on combat training that had kept him alive in hostile territory. Around the showroom, other buyers were beginning to sense the tension. Conversations became more subdued, and several people started moving toward the exit. The dealers who'd been so confident and aggressive earlier now seemed uncertain, like predators who'd suddenly realized they might be prey. "Perhaps," Blackstone continued, his voice carrying a subtle threat, "anyone who might have items related to Elena Rodriguez could save us all some time by identifying themselves now. We're prepared to be very generous for the right cooperation." David's mind raced. Elena had worked for the Weatherby family for over 20 years. Richard Blackstone, the name sounded familiar, like something Elena might have mentioned in passing. A family lawyer, maybe, or business associate. Someone with enough power and resources to track down a dead housekeeper's belongings within weeks of her funeral. The athletic man was getting closer to David's section, methodically working his way through the crowd. In about 2 minutes, he'd reach David's corner and there would be no hiding the jewelry box. David needed an exit strategy, but the three men had positioned themselves to cover all the main entrances. David's phone buzzed with a text message. Without looking away from his surveillance of the room, he glanced down at the screen. It was from Marcus, his veteran buddy. "Dude, turn on Channel 7 News right now. Something about your grandma's old employers." The timing was too coincidental to ignore. David's heart rate spiked as pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place. Elena hadn't just hidden valuable documents, she'd hidden dangerous ones. Documents that powerful people would kill to keep secret, important enough to send corporate investigators to hunt down a dead woman's jewelry box. The envelope beneath his hands suddenly felt radioactive. Whatever Elena had discovered about the Weatherby family, whatever truth she'd felt compelled to preserve, it was valuable enough to attract this kind of attention. And dangerous enough that Elena had spent years hiding it in a secret compartment. David realized he was facing the same kind of life-or-death decision he'd made countless times in Iraq: retreat to safety or push forward into unknown danger. But this time, the enemy wasn't carrying AK-47s and wearing suicide vests. This time, the enemy wore expensive suits and carried legal documents and had the kind of resources that could make a struggling veteran disappear without a trace. The athletic man was now 3 rows away from David's position. In less than 60 seconds, David would have to make his choice: surrender Elena's secret to these men, or find a way to escape with information that might be worth $2.80 million. His grandmother's final words echoed in his mind: "There are things inside that matter more than you know." Elena had trusted him with her secret. Now David had to decide whether he was brave enough, or desperate enough, to honor that trust. Richard Blackstone commanded the estate sale floor like a general surveying a battlefield. At 62, he had the bearing of a man who'd spent decades making problems disappear for people wealthy enough to afford his particular brand of discretion. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his handmade Italian shoes clicked with authority on the polished concrete, and his cold blue eyes missed nothing as they swept the room. David studied him from his corner position, applying the same threat assessment techniques he'd used to evaluate enemy commanders in Iraq. Blackstone wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous in the way that only comes from having unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. The kind of man who could make someone disappear with a phone call and sleep peacefully afterward. Mr. Blackstone. Mrs. Chen was saying, her voice trembling slightly, I really must insist on seeing some identification before I can discuss our inventory with you. Blackstone's smile was razor thin. Of course. He reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, producing a leather wallet that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. Richard Blackstone, senior partner, Blackstone and Associates. We handle sensitive matters for several prominent California families. The business card he handed to Mrs. Chen looked expensive, thick cardstock with embossed lettering. David caught a glimpse of an address on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. This wasn't some small-time lawyer or estate administrator. This was the kind of legal firepower that old money families kept on retainer to handle their darkest secrets. Blackstone's two companions spread out with military precision, and David got a better look at their individual characteristics. The younger man, probably in his 30s, had the controlled movements of former special forces. His suit couldn't quite hide the muscular build of someone who spent serious time in the gym, and David noticed the slight bulge under his left armpit that suggested a shoulder holster. Professional muscle disguised as corporate security, the older companion was more subtle but potentially more dangerous. Probably 55, graying at the temples, with the patient eyes of someone who specialized in information gathering. A private investigator, most likely, or corporate intelligence operative. The kind of man who could find out everything about your life before you realized he was looking. Now then, Blackstone continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, we're looking for items that may have been misappropriated from one of our client families. Specifically, we're interested in a wooden jewelry box that once belonged to Elena Rodriguez, a former domestic employee. David's blood ran cold at hearing Elena described as domestic employee rather than by name. To Blackstone, she hadn't been a person, just hired help who'd apparently taken something that didn't belong to her. The casual dismissal in his tone revealed everything about how he viewed people like Elena and David. Mrs. Chen was clearly out of her depth. Sir, I can assure you that everything in this sale has proper provenance. The Peterson family provided complete documentation for all items. I'm sure they believe that, Blackstone replied with condescending patience. However, stolen property has a way of changing hands multiple times before surfacing at events like this. We're simply here to recover items that rightfully belong to our clients. The younger man, David had started thinking of him as the muscle, was now methodically photographing people in the crowd with his phone. Not subtle documentation, but deliberate intimidation. He wanted people to know they were being recorded, cataloged, identified for future reference. What gives you the right to photograph our customers? Mrs. Chen demanded, finding some backbone. Blackstone's expression didn't change. In California, photography in public spaces is completely legal. We're simply documenting our investigation. For our client's protection. The older investigator, the bloodhound, in David's mental classification system, was taking a different approach. He was engaging in casual conversation with various buyers, asking innocent-seeming questions about what they were shopping for, where they'd heard about the sale, whether they'd found anything particularly interesting. David recognized the technique from intelligence briefings. Seemingly friendly conversation that was actually systematic information gathering. Within minutes, the bloodhound would have a complete picture of who was at the sale, what they were buying, and whether any of them matched the profile of someone who might possess Elena's jewelry box. You know, Blackstone said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet showroom. Elena Rodriguez worked for the Weatherby family for over 20 years. During that time, certain valuable documents may have come into her possession. Documents that could be misunderstood by people unfamiliar with complex family business arrangements. It was a threat wrapped in corporate speak. Anyone who had Elena's documents would be painted as having stolen property, regardless of how they'd actually acquired it. Blackstone was already building his legal narrative, preparing to destroy anyone who stood between him and Elena's secret. David felt his military training kick into high gear. These weren't just corporate investigators, they were a coordinated team with specific roles and considerable resources. Blackstone was the authority figure, designed to intimidate through official presence. The muscle provided physical enforcement capability. The bloodhound gathered intelligence and identified targets, but David also recognized something else from his combat experience. They were operating under constraints. This wasn't Baghdad, they couldn't just kick down doors and take what they wanted. They had to maintain the facade of legal authority, which meant they had weaknesses David could potentially exploit. The question was whether he had the skills and courage to outmaneuver them. Furthermore, Blackstone continued, his voice taking on an edge of steel, anyone found in possession of property belonging to our clients will face the full weight of legal action. We have teams of attorneys prepared to pursue criminal charges. for theft, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. David's hands tightened on the jewelry box. The envelope hidden beneath felt like it was burning against his fingers. Elena had risked everything to preserve whatever secret was contained in those documents. She'd hidden it for years, probably decades, knowing that powerful people would come looking for it eventually. Now they were here, and David was the only thing standing between Elena's final trust and the kind of corporate machinery that crushed ordinary people without a second thought. The muscle was getting closer, now only 2 rows away from David's position. In less than 30 seconds, there would be nowhere to hide. Elena's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, "There are things inside that matter more than you know." David realized he was about to find out exactly what his grandmother had thought was worth dying to protect. The muscle reached David's row and began his systematic examination of buyers, starting with an elderly woman examining vintage china. David watched him work, noting the professional way he scanned people's belongings while maintaining the facade of casual interest. When the man spoke, his voice carried the clipped precision of someone with military training. "Excuse me, ma'am," the muscle said to the elderly woman, his tone friendly but firm. "I'm working with the estate sale organizers to verify some items. Mind if I take a quick look at what you're considering?" The woman seemed flustered but complied, showing him a set of delicate teacups. He examined them briefly, dismissed them with a shake of his head, and moved on to the next person. David realized this wasn't random intimidation. They were using a process of elimination, systematically ruling out items until they found what they were looking for. David forced himself to remain calm and continue the charade of examining books. But his peripheral vision tracked the muscle's steady approach. 3 more people. 2 more. Now the man was standing directly beside a middle-aged collector who was holding a small wooden jewelry box, not Elena's, but similar enough to warrant investigation. "That's an interesting piece," the muscle said, his voice carrying new intensity. "Mind if I take a closer look?" The collector, a nervous man in his 40s, hesitated. Well, I haven't purchased it yet. I'm not sure I should let strangers handle merchandise." Blackstone's voice cut across the showroom like a blade. "Sir, we're investigating stolen property. I'm sure you understand the importance of cooperation in matters of criminal investigation." The word "criminal" hung in the air like a threat. David watched as the collector's face went pale and he immediately handed over the jewelry box. The muscle examined it thoroughly, checking the interior, feeling for hidden compartments, comparing it against something on his phone, probably a photograph of Elena's box. After 30 seconds, he shook his head and handed it back. "Not what we're looking for." But his eyes were already moving to the next person in line. David's military training kicked into high gear. He had perhaps 20 seconds before direct confrontation became unavoidable. His options were extremely limited: try to blend in and hope they overlooked him, attempt to leave without drawing attention, or prepare for the inevitable encounter. The bloodhound had positioned himself near the main entrance, effectively cutting off David's primary escape route. Blackstone remained near the front desk, where he could observe the entire showroom while maintaining his intimidating presence. They'd created a perfect trap, probably a technique they'd used dozens of times before. "You there," the muscle said, his attention now focused entirely on David with the military jacket. David looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read, meeting the man's eyes with the steady gaze he'd learned from dealing with hostile forces overseas. "Yes? I notice you've been sitting here for quite a while. Find anything interesting?" It was a test question, designed to gauge David's reaction and determine whether he was hiding something. David recognized the interrogation technique: start with innocent-seeming questions and watch for nervous responses. "Just browsing," David replied, his voice calm and level. "Looking for books, maybe some vintage items for my apartment." The muscle's eyes swept over David's appearance, taking in the faded military jacket, the worn jeans, the general appearance of someone operating on a tight budget. David could see him making calculations: veteran, probably struggling financially, possibly desperate enough to steal valuable items. "Former military?" the muscle asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Marine Corps. 3 tours in Iraq." Something flickered in the muscle's eyes: professional recognition, maybe even a moment of respect. But it didn't change his mission parameters. "See any action?" "Enough." David's response was deliberately brief, the way veterans talked when they didn't want to discuss details with civilians. The Blackstone had noticed the conversation and was moving closer, drawn by the sound of potential resistance. David could feel the net tightening around him as the 3-man team began to converge on his position. "You know," the muscle continued, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "we're looking for items that might have belonged to Elena Rodriguez. She worked as domestic help for some prominent families before she died recently. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" It was David's first real test. They were probing to see if he had any connection to Elena, probably. Hoping he'd reveal information voluntarily rather than forcing them to extract it through more aggressive means, David kept his expression neutral. Can't say I do. Common name around here, lots of Rodriguez families in Riverside. That's true, the muscle agreed, but his eyes were now scanning David's immediate area more carefully. What's that you have there beside you? David's heart rate spiked, but his military training kept his voice steady. Books. Like I said, I'm browsing for reading material. But the muscle wasn't looking at the books. His gaze had locked onto the wooden jewelry box that David had partially concealed beneath a vintage hardcover novel. The man's posture changed. Subtly, becoming more alert, more focused. That's an interesting box, the muscle said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable note of satisfaction. Looks like something that might have sentimental value. Family heirloom, maybe? David realized they'd reached the point of no return. The man had spotted Elena's jewelry box and was now beginning the process of taking it from him. Every word. From this point forward would be part of an interrogation designed to determine how much David knew and how much resistance he was prepared to offer. If Blackstone was now close enough to join the conversation, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor as he approached. The bloodhound had shifted position to block any potential escape route toward the back of the building. Is there a problem here? Blackstone asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having problems solved quickly and quietly. The muscle nodded toward the jewelry box. This gentleman has an item that matches our description. I was just asking him about its provenance. Blackstone's cold blue eyes fixed on David with laser intensity. Indeed. Sir, would you mind if we examine that box? We're investigating a theft, and your cooperation would be greatly appreciated. David realized Elena's secret was about to be exposed unless he found a way to outmaneuver 3 professional operators in a public space filled with potential witnesses. His grandmother had entrusted him with something worth $2.8 million, and now he had seconds to decide whether he was willing to fight for it. The envelope hidden beneath the jewelry box felt like it was burning against his fingers, and Elena's final words echoed in his memory. There are things inside that matter more than you know. Time was up. David had to choose between surrender and war. Blackstone stepped closer to David's corner, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. At 6'2", he towered over David's seated position, a deliberate power play designed to make the veteran feel small and vulnerable. The expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the predatory energy radiating from the man. Let me be more direct, Blackstone said, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more threatening than shouting. That jewelry box matches the exact description of property stolen from the Weatherby family. Elena Rodriguez was terminated for theft, and we have reason to believe she distributed stolen items to family members before her death. The accusation hit David like a physical blow. Elena, a thief? The woman who'd worked multiple jobs to raise him, who'd never taken so much as a pen from her employers, who'd taught him that integrity was the only thing poverty couldn't steal from you. Blackstone was rewriting history, painting Elena as a criminal to justify whatever they were about to do. That's not true, David said, his voice steady but his eyes flashing with anger. My grandmother wasn't a thief. Emotional attachment is understandable, Blackstone replied with mock sympathy. But facts are facts. The Weatherby family has documentation proving that several valuable items went missing during Elena's final months of employment. Items that have since surfaced in estate sales and pawn shops throughout Southern California. The muscle moved closer, now standing directly beside David's chair. His proximity was clearly intentional, close enough to reach David instantly if violence became necessary, close enough that David could smell his cologne and hear his controlled breathing. Military intimidation tactics adapted for corporate warfare. Sir, the muscle said, his voice deceptively polite, I'm going to need you to stand up and step away from that box. It wasn't a request. The man's tone carried the expectation of immediate compliance, backed by the implicit threat of physical force. David recognized the technique from his own military training: give clear commands in a calm voice, but be prepared to enforce them with violence if necessary. David remained seated, his hands resting casually on the jewelry box. I don't think so. This belonged to my grandmother, and I have the documentation to prove it. The atmosphere in the estate sale shifted perceptibly. Other buyers had noticed the confrontation and were beginning to back away, creating a circle of empty space around David's corner. Mrs. Chen looked torn between intervening and calling security, but her nervous glances toward Blackstone suggested she was intimidated by his legal authority. Documentation can be forged, Blackstone said smoothly. But our clients have photographs, receipts, and insurance records dating back decades. Your grandmother may have convinced you that these items belonged to her, but that doesn't make it legally true. The bloodhound had moved closer as well, completing their triangle of intimidation. David was now surrounded by 3 men, each positioned to block a potential escape route. They'd done this before, the coordination was too smooth, too practiced. To be improvised. You know what I think happened? Blackstone continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a closing argument to a jury. I think Elena Rodriguez realized she was dying and decided to provide for her grandson by stealing valuable items from her employers. She probably convinced herself it was justified, payment for years of loyal service, compensation for wages she thought were too low. Each word was calculated to provoke David into an emotional response. They wanted him angry, wanted him to make a mistake that would justify whatever force they were prepared to use. David's combat training told him to stay calm, but his love for Elena made every accusation feel like a personal attack. But theft is theft, Blackstone said, spreading his hands as if delivering an obvious truth. Regardless of the motivation. And now you're in possession of stolen property, which makes you an accessory after the fact. The muscle shifted his weight slightly, a subtle preparation for action. David caught the movement in his peripheral vision and recognized it immediately. The man was getting ready to grab the jewelry box, probably planning to snatch it while David was distracted by Blackstone's verbal assault. The good news, Blackstone continued, is that we're prepared to be reasonable about this. Surrender the items voluntarily, sign a statement acknowledging that they belong to our clients, and we'll consider this a case of mistaken inheritance. Rather than deliberate theft. It was a trap disguised as mercy. Sign their statement, and David would be admitting that Elena was a thief while simultaneously giving up any legal claim to whatever was hidden in the jewelry box. He'd lose Elena's secret and destroy her reputation in the process. And if I refuse? David asked, though he already knew the answer. The muscle's hand moved slightly, adjusting his position in a way that would give him maximum leverage for a grab-and-run maneuver. The bloodhound had his phone out, probably recording everything to document their legal recovery of stolen property. Then we'll be forced to involve law enforcement, Blackstone said with fake regret. Criminal charges will be filed, your military benefits could be affected, and this whole situation becomes much more complicated for everyone involved. The threat was clear: cooperate or be destroyed. They had the resources to drag David through a legal system he couldn't afford to fight, to paint him as a criminal in court records that would follow him for the rest of his life. For a veteran already struggling to make ends meet, criminal charges could mean the end of any chance at stable employment, but David also knew something they didn't. The envelope hidden beneath the jewelry box contained information worth $2.80 million, enough to change his entire life, enough to honor Elena's final gift. Enough to prove that whatever she'd hidden was far more valuable than anything she could have stolen. The question was whether he was willing to fight 3 professional operators in a public space to protect Elena's secret. The muscle's hand moved another inch closer to the jewelry box. David felt the familiar calm that had settled over him before firefights in Iraq. The moment when talking ended and action began, time to find out whether his grandmother's final trust was worth going to war for. Perhaps, Blackstone said with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to getting his way, we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Mrs. Chen, do you have an office where we could discuss this matter without disturbing your other customers? David's military instinct screamed danger. Moving to a confined space would eliminate witnesses, reduce his options, and give them complete control over the situation. But refusing would also escalate the confrontation in front of a crowd that was already nervous and backing away. Mrs. Chen nodded quickly, clearly eager to resolve whatever was happening before it drove away her remaining customers. Yes, of course. We have a small office in the back. Right this way. Excellent, Blackstone replied, then turned his cold gaze to David. Shall we? It wasn't really a question. The muscle stepped closer, his positioning making it clear that David would be escorted to the office whether he agreed or not. The bloodhound had already moved to block any potential escape route toward the exit. While Blackstone maintained his authoritative presence, David calculated his options rapidly. He could refuse and force a confrontation here in the main showroom. But that would put innocent bystanders at risk and give the 3 men justification for using force. He could try to run, but the bloodhound was blocking the exit and David would have to abandon the jewelry box and Elena's secret in the process. Or he could go to the office and hope that his military training would give him an advantage in close quarters if the situation turned violent. Fine, David said, standing slowly and keeping the jewelry box clutched firmly in his hands. But I want it on record that I'm cooperating voluntarily. Of course, Blackstone smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. We appreciate your cooperation. The walk to the office felt like a death march. Other buyers stepped aside. As the group passed, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and relief that they weren't involved in whatever drama was unfolding. David noticed several people reaching for their phones, probably to record video or call someone about the disturbance. Mrs. Chen led them through a maze of furniture displays toward the back of the building, past items that seemed to watch their passage like silent witnesses. The office was exactly what David had feared, a small, windowless room with only one entrance, barely large enough for a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. Once inside, they'd be completely isolated from potential help. "Here we are, Mrs. Chen said nervously, opening the door to reveal a cramped space that smelled of old paperwork and stale coffee. "I'll just leave you gentlemen to your business." She practically fled back toward the main showroom, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. David didn't blame her, the tension radiating from Blackstone and his team was almost palpable. "After you," Blackstone said, gesturing toward the office with mock politeness. David stepped inside, immediately assessing the tactical situation. The room was perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with no windows and only the single door behind him. A small desk dominated one wall, covered with estate sale paperwork and an outdated computer. 2 mismatched chairs faced the desk, while a filing cabinet occupied the corner. The confined space would work both for and against him. His military close-quarters combat training had taught him to fight effectively in tight spaces, but it also meant that if violence erupted, there would be no room for maneuvering or escape. The muscle entered next, his bulk seeming to fill half the remaining space. He positioned himself near the door, ostensibly casual, but David recognized the placement as a classic blocking maneuver. No one would be leaving this room without going through him first. The bloodhound came in third, immediately pulling out his phone and setting it on the desk. "For documentation purposes," he explained, though David suspected it was also a recording device that would capture anything David might say that could be used against him later. If Blackstone entered last, his presence somehow making the small room feel even more claustrophobic. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded ominously final in the confined space. "Much better," Blackstone said, settling into the chair behind the desk as if he owned the place. "Now we can speak frankly without worrying about public relations." The mask of corporate civility was already beginning to slip away from potential witnesses. Blackstone's demeanor became noticeably harder, more direct. The muscle had shifted his stance slightly, no longer maintaining the pretense of being a simple security consultant. "Let's cut to the chase," Blackstone continued, his voice losing its earlier politeness. "We know Elena Rodriguez stole valuable documents from the Weatherby family during her final months of employment. We know she hid those documents somewhere, and we strongly suspect they're in that jewelry box you're holding." David remained standing, keeping his back to the wall and his eyes on all 3 men. The jewelry box felt heavier in his hands, weighted with Elena's secret and his own growing understanding of how dangerous that secret must be. Those documents contained sensitive family information that could be misinterpreted by people unfamiliar with complex business arrangements, Blackstone said. Information that could damage reputations, destroy relationships, and cause significant financial harm to innocent parties. It was the first hint about what Elena might have discovered. Not just valuable items, but information, secrets that powerful people would pay millions to keep hidden. David thought about Elena's cryptic final words about connections that matter more than money, and things that sometimes become the same thing. The bloodhound was watching David's facial expressions carefully, probably trained to read micro-expressions and detect lies. The muscle had positioned himself so that he could reach David in 2 quick steps, his body language suggesting he was ready to move at any moment. "Now," Blackstone said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm going to ask you one more time to hand over that jewelry box voluntarily. Because once we move to more persuasive methods, your cooperation becomes significantly less valuable to us." The threat hung in the air like smoke. David realized they'd brought him to this isolated room not just to intimidate him, but to do whatever was necessary to get Elena's secret, even if it meant violence that would leave no witnesses. The envelope hidden beneath the jewelry box suddenly felt like it was burning against his fingers. Whatever Elena had discovered about the Weatherby family, it was dangerous enough that powerful men were willing to threaten a decorated veteran in a closed room to get it back. David's military training told him the situation was about to become kinetic. The question was whether he was ready for a fight that could determine not just his financial future, but possibly his survival. The office door clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo in the confined space. Blackstone settled into his chair like a predator claiming territory, while the muscle and the bloodhound took up positions that effectively trapped David in the small room. What had begun as corporate intimidation was now evolving into something far more dangerous. "You know, David," Blackstone said, using his first name with deliberate familiarity, "we've done our homework on you. 3 tours in Iraq, Purple Heart. Recipient, explosive specialist. Very impressive military record. The casual mention of his service record sent ice through David's veins. These men hadn't just stumbled upon him at the estate sale, they'd been tracking him, researching him, preparing for this exact confrontation. David realized Elena's death had triggered some kind of investigation that had led them directly to her only surviving family member. "We also know about your current situation," the bloodhound added, consulting his phone with the casual air of someone reading a grocery list. "Medical debt from your shoulder surgery, 3 months behind on rent. Part-time employment at Rodriguez Hardware on Mission Street. Your landlord filed an eviction notice last Tuesday." David's jaw tightened. They'd invaded every aspect of his privacy, turned his personal struggles into weapons to use against him. The systematic nature of their intelligence gathering revealed just how much resources they had at their disposal. "The point is," Blackstone continued smoothly, "we understand you're in a desperate financial situation. That desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider, like holding on to stolen property in hopes of finding a buyer." The muscle shifted slightly, his movement deliberate and threatening. "We've seen it before. Veterans coming home, struggling to make ends meet, making bad decisions because they feel like the system failed them." It was psychological warfare disguised as sympathy. They were trying to provide David with a narrative that would let him surrender Elena's secret while saving face, the struggling veteran driven to crime by circumstances beyond his control. "But here's what you need to understand," Blackstone said, his voice hardening. "The Weatherby family has been incredibly patient about recovering their stolen property. They've chosen to handle this matter privately rather than involving law enforcement immediately. That patience has limits." The bloodhound pulled up something else on his phone, turning the screen so David could see it. "This is a federal criminal complaint, already prepared and ready for filing. Conspiracy to commit theft, interstate transportation of stolen goods, violation of the Patriot Act for possession of classified financial documents." David's blood went cold. The Patriot Act? What kind of documents had Elena discovered that would invoke federal terrorism statutes? He thought about her final words, her insistence that the jewelry box contained things more important than he could imagine. "The beauty of the Patriot Act," Blackstone explained with obvious satisfaction, "is that it allows for detention without bail while investigations proceed. You could spend months, even years, in federal custody while we determine the full extent of your grandmother's crimes and your involvement in them." The walls of the small office seemed to be closing in. David's military training had prepared him for many threats, but not this kind of legal warfare conducted by men with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. "Of course," the muscle added, his tone suggesting reasonableness, "all of this could be avoided with a simple business transaction. You give us the jewelry box and its contents, we give you enough money to solve your immediate financial problems." It was the carrot after the stick, financial salvation in exchange for Elena's secret. David wondered how many people had accepted similar offers over the years, trading away potentially explosive information for just enough money to solve their immediate problems. "How much?" David asked, though he had no intention of accepting any offer. He needed to understand how valuable Elena's discovery really was. Blackstone smiled, recognizing the question as a sign of potential cooperation. $50,000. Cash. Immediate payment, no questions asked, no paperwork, no trail back to you. 50,000 was more money than David had ever seen at one time. It would solve his rent problems, pay off his medical debt, give him breathing room to find better employment. For a man 3 months behind on rent, it was life-changing money, but David also understood the economics of the offer. If they were willing to pay 50,000 immediately, Elena's secret was worth exponentially more. The envelope hidden beneath the jewelry box contained information worth enough to justify hiring professional intimidators, conducting federal-level background checks, and preparing terrorist-related charges. "Think about it logically," the bloodhound said, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone explaining obvious facts. "Your grandmother was a house cleaner. Whatever she thought she found, she probably misunderstood its significance. Documents that look important to untrained eyes are often just routine business paperwork." They were trying to convince him that Elena had been too ignorant to understand what she'd discovered, that her 40 years of experience with wealthy families meant nothing, that her careful preservation of documents in a secret compartment was the paranoid act of an uneducated woman. The insult to Elena's intelligence made David's anger spike, but his military training kept his expression neutral. These men were systematically attacking everything he valued: his financial security, his legal standing, his family's reputation, and his grandmother's memory. "We're offering you a way out," Blackstone said, leaning forward with predatory intensity. "Take the money, walk away, start over somewhere new." Continue down this path, and you'll lose everything: your freedom, your benefits, your future. The muscle had moved closer, no longer maintaining even the pretense of casual positioning. His proximity was a clear threat: accept the offer, or face the consequences. David looked down at the jewelry box in his hands, thinking about Elena's final gift and her trust in his ability to handle whatever she discovered. $50,000 versus $2.8 million. Financial security versus the truth about what had driven his grandmother to hide documents for years. The systematic intimidation campaign had revealed just how desperately these men wanted Elena's secret back. The question was whether David was strong enough to resist their pressure and discover what his grandmother had thought was worth protecting with her life. David's silence stretched long enough that the bloodhound began showing signs of impatience, checking his watch and exchanging glances with the muscle. The $50,000 offer hung in the air like bait on a hook, but David's military training had taught him that when enemies became impatient, they revealed their true intentions. "You're taking a long time to consider what should be a simple decision," Blackstone said, his voice carrying the first hint of genuine irritation. "Perhaps you need additional motivation to understand the seriousness of your situation." The bloodhound pulled up something new on his phone, turning the screen toward David with obvious satisfaction. "This is Elena Rodriguez's criminal record, compiled from our investigation. Multiple counts of theft from previous employers, a pattern of manipulating elderly clients, and evidence of systematic exploitation of the families who trusted her." David's vision went red around the edges. The documents on the phone screen looked official: police reports, witness statements, even what appeared to be mugshot photos of his grandmother. But David knew with absolute certainty that every single word was fabricated, every image doctored, every accusation a complete lie. Elena had been investigated by police exactly once in her 40-year career, when Mrs. Ashford's diamond bracelet went missing and was later found in the family's vacation home, forgotten after a trip to Malibu. Elena had voluntarily submitted to questioning and a polygraph test, both of which completely cleared her of any wrongdoing. "These records will be filed with law enforcement within the hour," the bloodhound continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone revealing a winning hand. "Elena Rodriguez will be posthumously charged with multiple felonies, and your inheritance will be seized as proceeds from criminal activity." The attack on Elena's reputation was calculated and vicious. They weren't just threatening David's future. They were destroying his grandmother's legacy, turning 40 years of honest work into a criminal conspiracy. Elena, who had saved every thank you card from the children she'd helped raise, who had been invited to family weddings and graduations, who had earned genuine love and respect from people who barely noticed most of their employees. Of course, Blackstone added with mock sympathy, "Those charges could be reconsidered if we determined that Elena was manipulated by outside parties. Perhaps family members who convinced her to steal items for them." It was a masterful psychological attack. They'd created a narrative where David could save Elena's reputation only by accepting blame for her alleged crimes. Admit to manipulating his dying grandmother, and they'd paint her as a victim rather than a criminal. But David saw through their strategy. The fabricated criminal record wasn't just intimidation, it was preparation. If he refused their offer, they'd file the false charges posthumously, ensuring that anyone who tried to investigate Elena's real discoveries would find only records of a dishonest house cleaner with a pattern of theft. "She stole more than objects," the muscle said, stepping closer until he was close enough to touch David. "She stole family secrets, private information, confidential business documents. That's a federal crime under multiple statutes." The mention of stolen secrets made David's pulse quicken. They were confirming that Elena had discovered information, not just valuable items. Documents important enough to fabricate an entire criminal history to discredit her posthumously. "But the real crime," Blackstone said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, "was what she did with those secrets in her final months." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, opening it to reveal what appeared to be medical records from Elena's final hospital stay. David recognized the letterhead from Riverside General, where he'd spent countless hours at Elena's bedside during her final weeks. "Your grandmother's cancer had metastasized to her brain," Blackstone said with clinical detachment. "The oncology reports show significant cognitive impairment, paranoid delusions, and what the doctors described as elaborate fantasy construction. She believed people were following her, that her former employers were trying to harm her family." David's hands clenched involuntarily. Elena's brain cancer had been devastating to watch, but her cognitive function had remained sharp until the very end. She'd been discussing current events, solving crossword puzzles, and beating David at chess just days before her death. The paranoia Blackstone described had never existed. The medical consensus, the bloodhound added, consulting the fabricated records, was that Elena had developed elaborate delusions about possessing valuable information. She became convinced that routine household documents were evidence of criminal conspiracies. They were systematically destroying every aspect of Elena's credibility. Not just a thief, but a mentally incompetent one whose final months had been consumed by brain cancer-induced fantasies. Anyone who tried to take her hidden documents seriously would be dismissed as gullible fools believing the paranoid delusions of a dying woman. So you see, Blackstone concluded with false reasonableness, whatever Elena told you about those documents, whatever she claimed they contained, was the product of a diseased mind creating conspiracy theories from meaningless paperwork. The final insult hung in the air like poison. Elena, reduced to a brain-damaged criminal whose final gift to her grandson was worthless trash disguised as treasure by cancer-induced delusions. David thought about Elena's final words, delivered with perfect clarity and unmistakable love. There are things inside that matter more than you know. Not the words of a delusional woman, but the final instructions of someone who had discovered something so dangerous that powerful people would spend years fabricating evidence to discredit her. The muscle reached out slowly, deliberately, and placed his hand on the jewelry box. Time to let go of your grandmother's fantasies. It was the moment David had been dreading and preparing for since the confrontation began. They weren't just demanding Elena's secret, they were desecrating her memory, turning her final act of love into evidence of mental illness and criminal behavior. Elena Rodriguez had been the most honest person David had ever known. She'd raised him with integrity, taught him to value truth over convenience, and trusted him with her final secret despite knowing it would put him in danger. The choice was no longer between $50,000 and financial ruin. It was between honoring Elena's trust and allowing these men to destroy everything she'd stood for. David's military training told him that some lines, once crossed, demanded a response regardless of the consequences. They just crossed one of those lines. The muscle's hand tightened on the jewelry box, but David didn't release his grip. For a moment, both men held Elena's final gift between them like a bridge over an abyss that neither wanted to cross. The small office seemed to hold its breath, as 3 decades of military discipline warred with a grandson's love for the woman who'd raised him. "Let go," the muscle said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." David's knuckles were white against the wooden surface of the jewelry box, but his voice remained steady. "This belonged to my grandmother. It's all I have left of her." Blackstone laughed, a sound like breaking glass that filled the confined space with contempt. "What you have left is the delusions of a diseased mind and the stolen property of people who actually matter." Elena Rodriguez was hired help who got ideas above her station. The casual dismissal of Elena's worth as a human being hit David like a physical blow. To Blackstone, Elena hadn't been a person with feelings, dreams, and dignity. She'd been a servant whose only value was the labor she provided to her betters. "You want to know what really happened?" Blackstone continued, settling back in his chair as if preparing to deliver a lecture to a slow student. "Elena spent 40 years cleaning toilets and scrubbing floors for families who barely noticed her existence. She became invisible furniture in their homes, forgotten the moment she left each day." The bloodhound was recording everything now, his phone positioned to capture David's reactions for whatever legal proceedings they were planning. David realized this entire conversation was being documented as evidence of his supposed criminal conspiracy. "But in her final months," Blackstone said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child, "Elena's brain cancer made her paranoid and resentful. She started believing she deserved more than the generous wages she'd been paid for decades of simple manual labor." Each word was calculated to diminish Elena's contributions, to reduce 40 years of dedication and trust to nothing more than simple manual labor, performed by someone too delusional to appreciate her employer's generosity. "So she started taking things," the muscle added, his grip on the jewelry box becoming more insistent. "Documents, photographs, personal items. She convinced herself that her employers owed her something beyond fair wages and excellent references." David felt something cold and dangerous settling in his chest. These men weren't just lying about Elena, they genuinely believed that people like her had no right to anything beyond what their wealthy employers chose to give them. In their world, housekeepers and veterans and ordinary people existed solely to serve the interests of those with power and money. "The tragic part," the bloodhound said with mock sympathy, "is that she dragged you into her delusions. A decorated veteran, manipulated by a dying woman's brain cancer fantasies into believing he'd inherited something valuable. It was the perfect narrative for their purposes. David as the innocent victim of his grandmother's diseased mind, Elena as the delusional criminal who'd stolen worthless documents and convinced her grandson they were treasure. A story that would play well in court and justify whatever they were about to do, but then Blackstone made his fatal mistake. He opened the folder of fabricated medical records again, pulling out what appeared to be a psychiatric evaluation with Elena's name on it. The document was covered with official-looking stamps and signatures, clearly designed to appear authentic. According to the psychiatric evaluation ordered by Riverside General, Blackstone said with obvious satisfaction, Elena Rodriguez suffered from what doctors call grandiose delusions with paranoid features. She believed she was important enough to possess valuable secrets, when in reality she was just another aging immigrant who'd outlived her usefulness. The final phrase hung in the air like a death sentence, outlived her usefulness. David's vision narrowed to a tunnel focused entirely on Blackstone's smug face. Elena, who had worked 3 jobs to raise him after his parents died. Elena, who had attended every school play and graduation despite being exhausted from 14-hour days. Elena, who had loved him unconditionally while asking for nothing in return except his happiness and success. Outlived her usefulness. David repeated slowly, his voice carrying a new quality that made the muscles grip on the jewelry box falter slightly. Exactly, Blackstone said, completely missing the danger signal in David's tone. These families employ people like Elena out of charity, really. When someone stops being useful and starts becoming problematic, well, there are always younger, more grateful workers available. The casual discussion of Elena's disposability, the idea that human beings could outlive their usefulness, like broken appliances to be discarded, revealed everything David needed to know about these men and the people they represented. Elena hadn't been paranoid. She'd been right to be afraid. She discovered something that threatened people who viewed other human beings as disposable resources, and they'd been planning to destroy her reputation and memory long before her death. The good news, the bloodhound added with false cheer, is that we can clean up this entire mess. Elena's delusions die with her, you get enough money to start over, and everyone moves on with their lives. It was the ultimate insult wrapped in the language of mercy. Elena's life's work reduced to delusions, her final gift dismissed as worthless, and her grandson offered charity money to forget she'd ever mattered. The muscle tugged harder on the jewelry box, apparently sensing that the conversation was nearing its end. Time to let go of the past and face reality. But David had spent 3 tours in Iraq learning the difference between people worth fighting for and people worth fighting against. Elena Rodriguez had been worth everything good in his life. These men represented everything that was wrong with a world that treated decent people as disposable. The transformation David felt wasn't anger, it was something far more dangerous. It was the cold certainty of someone who had just decided that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect Elena's memory. Elena's trust. Elena's final gift, the muscle was about to learn that some lines shouldn't be crossed by people who'd outlived their usefulness. The air in the small office seemed to change density as David's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm he'd learned in combat zones. Something shifted in his posture, not aggressive, but suddenly unmovable, like a mountain that had decided it was tired of erosion. The muscle felt it first, his grip on the jewelry box loosening slightly as his trained instincts recognized danger. My grandmother, David said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that made all 3 men pause, never outlived her usefulness. She outlived yours. The words hung in the air with the weight of a declaration of war. Blackstone's smug expression faltered as he noticed the change in David's demeanor, the way his shoulders had squared, the way his eyes had gone flat and focused, the way he'd shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. Elena Rodriguez, David continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, raised me after my parents died. She worked 3 jobs to keep me in school. She taught me the difference between right and wrong. She showed me that dignity isn't something you can buy or sell or take away from someone. The bloodhound's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, probably reaching for something more threatening than a phone. David tracked the movement with peripheral vision while keeping his primary focus on the muscle, who still had one hand on Elena's jewelry box. She also taught me, David said, the temperature in the room seeming to drop 10 degrees, that when someone threatens your family, you don't negotiate. You don't compromise. You protect what matters. Blackstone tried to reassert control. Mr. Rodriguez, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. We're offering you a generous settlement for stolen property. There's no need for, stop talking, David interrupted, and something in his voice made Blackstone's mouth snap shut involuntarily. You've said enough. You've told me everything I need to know about who you are and what you represent. The transformation was complete now. The struggling veteran desperate for money had disappeared, replaced by someone who'd spent 3 tours learning how to handle multiple threats in confined spaces. David's military training hadn't made him violent. It had made him efficient. You think Elena was paranoid, David said, his eyes moving systematically between the three men, cataloging their positions, their capabilities, their weaknesses. You think she imagined threats that didn't exist. But she wasn't crazy. She was just 40 years ahead of schedule. The muscle's other hand moved toward his jacket, clearly reaching for a weapon. David noted the movement but didn't react yet. In close quarters, the person who moved first often lost the advantage to someone who moved better. Because the threat wasn't what she'd discovered, David continued, his voice carrying the same calm tone he'd used to brief missions in Iraq. The threat was what you'd do to anyone who discovered it. The threat was people like you, who think people like Elena only matter as long as they're useful to you. The Bloodhound's recording phone was still running, capturing every word of what they probably intended to use as evidence of David's unstable mental state. But David realized he didn't care anymore. Some things were worth fighting for regardless of the consequences. You fabricated criminal records, David said, his analysis of their operation continuing with military precision. You created false medical documents. You prepared federal charges that don't exist. You brought weapons to intimidate a veteran in a private room. The catalog of their crimes was delivered with the detached professionalism of an after-action report. David wasn't angry anymore, he was something far more dangerous. He was focused. But your biggest mistake, David said, and now his voice carried the authority of someone who'd led soldiers into combat, was thinking that Elena's secret was about what she found. It was never about what she found. It was about what she knew would happen to anyone who tried to use it. Blackstone's face had gone pale as he realized the veteran across from him wasn't intimidated, wasn't desperate, and wasn't going to be bought off with threats or money. Mr. Rodriguez, I strongly advise you to. Elena knew you'd come, David interrupted, his words cutting through Blackstone's bluster like a blade. She knew you'd fabricate evidence. She knew you'd try to destroy her reputation. She knew you'd threaten her family. That's why she didn't just hide documents. The jewelry box seemed to pulse between David and the muscle's competing grips, Elena's final gift suspended between two worlds, one where power meant money and intimidation, another where power meant protecting the people you loved. She hid proof, David said, and for the first time since entering the office, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Proof of what she found. Proof of what you did to hide it. And proof of what you're doing right now. The Bloodhound's phone wasn't the only recording device in the room. Elena had been 40 years ahead of schedule because she'd anticipated this exact moment, 3 men in expensive suits threatening her grandson over documents they claimed didn't matter. You see, David said, his military bearing now fully evident. As he prepared for the final phase of the operation, Elena Rodriguez didn't outlive her usefulness. She just outlived your ability to control the narrative. The muscle's hand tightened on his weapon, apparently deciding that negotiation had failed and force was the only remaining option. But he'd never faced someone with David's specific training, someone who'd spent years learning to handle multiple armed opponents in tight spaces. The small office had become a battlefield, and David Rodriguez had just stopped being a victim and started being what his training had made him, a weapon designed to protect what mattered most: Elena's memory. Elena's truth. Elena's final trust in the grandson she'd raised to do the right thing regardless of the cost. The transformation was complete. The real fight was about to begin. The first move came from the Bloodhound, his hand emerging from his jacket with what looked like a compact pistol. But David had been tracking the movement for 30 seconds, and 3 tours in Iraq had taught him that survival depended on being faster than your enemies expected. David's response was immediate and devastating. He twisted away from the muscle's grip on the jewelry box while simultaneously driving his elbow into the man's solar plexus with precision that came from years of close-quarters combat training. The muscle doubled over, gasping, his weapon never clearing its holster. In the same fluid motion, David pivoted toward the Bloodhound, whose pistol was halfway raised when David's combat boot connected with his wrist. The sharp crack of breaking bone echoed through the small office as the weapon spun away into the corner, and the Bloodhound collapsed into the filing cabinet with a scream that would have brought security running if the office hadn't been soundproofed. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. The Blackstone fumbled for something in his briefcase, but David was already moving. A simple combat technique, grab, twist, leverage, sent the older man sprawling across the desk, scattering his fabricated documents across the floor. The briefcase flew open, revealing not just legal papers but surveillance equipment, recording devices, and what appeared to be prepared evidence packages for multiple scenarios. Don't move, David said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given life and death orders in combat zones. All 3 men froze, recognizing that the struggling veteran they'd been intimidating had been replaced by someone infinitely more dangerous. With the immediate threats neutralized, David carefully opened Elena's jewelry box and retrieved the hidden envelope. His hands remained steady as he broke the seal that had protected his grandmother's secret for years, possibly decades. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be original recordings on small digital devices. But it was the first photograph that made David's breath catch in his throat. The image showed a much younger Elena standing beside a man in an expensive suit, not as a servant, but as an equal. They were both smiling, both wearing what appeared to be business attire, standing in front of what looked like a corporate office building. The back of the photograph was dated 1987 and bore an inscription, "To my business partner Elena, thank you for your discretion and loyalty. Marcus Weatherby. Business partner. Not housekeeper. Not servant. Business partner." David's hands moved through the documents with growing amazement. Financial records showing Elena Rodriguez as a silent partner in multiple real estate investments. Bank statements revealing accounts in her name containing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Legal documents establishing her as a co-investor in several Beverly Hills properties that had appreciated dramatically over 4 decades. "She wasn't your housekeeper," David said, his voice filled with wonder as he understood Elena's final secret. "She was your business partner." Blackstone tried to speak, but David held up a hand for silence while he continued reading. The documents told an incredible story. Elena Rodriguez, using her insider knowledge of wealthy families and their real estate investments, had become a silent partner in deals worth millions of dollars. The Weatherby family hadn't employed her, they'd worked with her. A letter in Elena's handwriting, dated just weeks before her death, explained everything. "My dearest David, for 40 years, I let wealthy families believe I was just their housekeeper while I built a fortune alongside them. I invested my wages wisely, partnered with them secretly, and accumulated assets worth nearly $3 million. The jewelry box contains proof of every investment, every partnership, every dollar. But I also discovered their plans to steal my share after my death, to claim I was just a delusional immigrant who'd stolen worthless documents. They underestimated Elena Rodriguez just like everyone else did. I was never their servant, I was their secret business partner, and now you're my heir. Use this wealth wisely, mijo. Lof, abuela." The final document was a properly executed will, witnessed and notarized, transferring Elena's entire portfolio to David Rodriguez. Real estate investments, stock holdings, and business partnerships worth exactly $2.80 million. David looked up from the documents to find all 3 men staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to fury. They hadn't come to recover stolen property, they'd come to steal an inheritance that Elena had legitimately earned and legally bequeathed to her grandson. "Marcus Weatherby tried to cut Elena out after her cancer diagnosis," David said, understanding flooding through him. "He thought a dying immigrant woman wouldn't be able to protect her investments. He was wrong." The bloodhound was holding his broken wrist and glaring at David with pure hatred. Those partnerships were never legitimate. She was just domestic help who got ideas above her station. "Actually," David said, pulling out what appeared to be a recording device that had been hidden beneath the documents, "Elena recorded every conversation she had with your clients over the past 2 years. Including the ones where they discussed stealing her share of their joint investments." He pressed play, and Marcus Weatherby's voice filled the office. "Elena's dying anyway. Who's going to believe a brain cancer patient's claims about secret business partnerships? We clean up the documentation, claim she stole some worthless papers, and pocket her share of the Beverly Hills properties." The recording continued with Blackstone's own voice, "I'll handle the legal aspects. Create some criminal records, forge medical documents claiming dementia. By the time we're done, she'll look like a delusional thief and her grandson will be happy to take $50,000. To make it all go away." David turned off the recording and looked at the 3 men who'd spent months planning to steal his inheritance. Elena Rodriguez wasn't paranoid. She was just smarter than you gave her credit for. The transformation was complete. David wasn't a struggling veteran anymore, he was a millionaire with evidence of corporate conspiracy, theft, and fraud. Elena's final gift hadn't just been money, it had been justice. The office door burst open as security guards, alerted by the bloodhound's scream, rushed in to find 3 corporate executives on the floor and 1 very calm veteran holding documents worth nearly $3 million. "Gentlemen," David said to the security guards, "I think you'll want to call the police. I have evidence of a very interesting conspiracy." 6 months later, David Rodriguez stood in the living room of his new home in Beverly Hills, not far from where Elena had spent 40 years being underestimated by people who thought they were smarter than the quiet woman who cleaned their houses and managed their secrets. The house wasn't a mansion. David had deliberately chosen something modest, something Elena would have approved of. But it was his, bought with money Elena had legitimately earned through decades of brilliant investment decisions that the wealthy families had never seen coming. The morning news was playing on his wall-mounted television, and David smiled as the anchor delivered an update on a story that had captivated the country for months, in what legal experts are calling one of the most significant corporate fraud cases in California history. 3 men have been sentenced to federal prison for conspiracy, attempted theft, and civil rights violations. Richard Blackstone, former senior partner at Blackstone and Associates, received 15 years. His associates received 10 and 12 years respectively. The anchor continued, the case centered around their attempt to steal nearly $3 million from the estate of Elena Rodriguez, a Beverly Hills businesswoman who had secretly partnered with wealthy families for over 4 decades. Rodriguez, who died of cancer last year, had anticipated the theft attempt and left behind recordings that prosecutors called the most comprehensive evidence of corporate conspiracy they'd ever seen. David turned off the television and walked to the mantelpiece, where Elena's jewelry box sat in a place of honor beside a framed photograph from her funeral. The photo showed dozens of people, not just family, but representatives from every family Elena had worked with over the years. People who'd flown in from across the country to honor a woman they genuinely loved and respected. Mrs. Ashford had spoken at the service, tears streaming down her face as she described Elena not as an employee, but as the wisest financial advisor our family ever had. The Prestons had established a scholarship in Elena's name at UCLA Business School. Even families David had never heard of had attended, all of them sharing stories of Elena's quiet wisdom, her investment advice, and her uncanny ability to spot opportunities that others missed. She never told us she was building her own portfolio, Mrs. Ashford had explained to David after the service. We just thought she was naturally gifted at understanding our investments. It wasn't until after she died that we realized she'd been making the same moves in her own accounts. She turned 40 years of house cleaning wages into a fortune by being smarter than any of us. The revelation had stunned Beverly Hills society. Elena Rodriguez hadn't been lucky or opportunistic, she'd been brilliant. While cleaning their homes, she'd observed their business discussions, understood their investment strategies, and quietly built her own empire using the same principles. She'd never stolen anything, she'd simply been too smart to remain poor. David's phone rang, displaying a number he now recognized. Marcus Weatherby Jr., calling from federal prison where he was serving a 20-year sentence for orchestrating the conspiracy to steal Elena's inheritance. David let it go to voicemail, as he had every week for the past 6 months. He had no interest in hearing Weatherby's apologies or pleas for forgiveness. Some actions were unforgivable, and trying to destroy Elena's reputation to steal her life's work was one of them. Instead, David opened the jewelry box and pulled out Elena's final letter, one he discovered weeks after the trial, hidden in a secret compartment even deeper than the first. The letter was dated just days before her death. My beloved David, if you're reading this, then you've honored my trust and protected our family's legacy. I want you to understand that I never told you about the money because I needed you to become the man you were meant to be on your own. The military made you strong. Adversity made you resilient. Love made you honorable. The money is just a tool. Use it to build something worthy of the Rodriguez name. But remember, Mijo, they didn't underestimate me because I was a housekeeper. They underestimated me because they couldn't imagine that someone they considered beneath them could be smarter than they were. Never forget that lesson. In this world, the most dangerous people are the ones others don't see coming. I spent 40 years watching wealthy families make the same mistake over and over. They confused money with intelligence, power with wisdom. They thought their advantages made them superior, when really those advantages made them lazy and careless. You, my grandson, have something they could never buy: integrity earned through struggle, wisdom gained through service, and strength forged in the crucible of protecting others. Use Elena's gift wisely, but never forget that the real treasure was always the man you became, not the money you inherited. The jewelry box is yours now, but the lesson is eternal. Never underestimate the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones society teaches you to ignore. They're often the ones changing the world while everyone else is looking the other way. Live with honor, love with courage, and always remember, your abuela was proud of you long before you had money. Con amor siempre, Elena Rodriguez, businesswoman. David carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the jewelry box. Through the window, he could see his new neighbors, wealthy families who had no idea that the quiet veteran next door was worth more than most of them, and had earned every penny through his grandmother's brilliance and his own courage. That afternoon, David drove to Riverside General Hospital, where he'd established the Elena Rodriguez Foundation for military veterans struggling with post-service transition. The foundation, funded by Elena's real estate portfolio, provided financial assistance, job training, and housing support for veterans who'd served their country only to find themselves forgotten by the system they'd protected. As he walked through the hospital corridors where Elena had spent her final days, David reflected on the lesson she'd taught him: never underestimate anyone. The housekeeper might be a secret businesswoman. The struggling veteran might be the most dangerous person in the room. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the underestimated ones, they're often the ones with the most to teach us about strength, wisdom, and the true meaning of wealth. Elena Rodriguez had spent her final act teaching the world that intelligence, integrity, and love were worth more than all the money in Beverly Hills. And her grandson would spend the rest of his life proving her right. The quiet ones, indeed, were the ones changing the world.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.